This is a microphone test. 3, 2, 1, 1, 3, 2. This is a microphone test. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a microphone test. Test. It's green. Now it's off. Talk.
Hello, 1, 2. I Sure.
3, 2.
3, 2, 1. Yeah. I'm on too.
Hello, it's 4 o'clock, time to go. I'm Gretchen Adkins. I'm a member of Grolier. I'm head of exhibitions in the downstairs exhibition space. And it's my honor to first welcome you, those of us that are in the room. And I understand there are 100 people online that want to be part of this conversation that we're going to have. I'm here to introduce our two speakers, Glen Miranker and Nicholas Basbanes, but they really don't need any introduction for you. They're both members of our club. They're both titans in their fields. But I do want to mention that, of course, Glen is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. If there is anyone entitled to be Sherlock Holmes, it is he. And his 221 objects in this room is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. No, I have maybe 8,000 items, I would say, in my.
Are we up to 8,000 now?
Up to 8,000, yeah.
Wow.
And Nicholas Basbanes, as you well know, is a well-published author. He currently has 10 books. He is the titan of stories about books, stories about collectors, and stories about their violators. Nick's first book, A Gentle Madness, has become some sort of Bible for our field. If you ever need to have a story to share with other friends, there's lots and lots of stories in this book. I'm going to read you just one short entry on the front panel. The passion to possess books has never been more widespread than it is today. Indeed, obsessive book collecting remains the only hobby to have a disease named after it. A gentle madness. We're all guilty. I turn it over to the two titans.
Well, thank you so much, Gretchen. Before I begin anything, I just want to congratulate Glen and Kathy, his wife, Miranker, not only for this extraordinary exhibition. Kathy is your co-curator.
Absolutely.
And I think we should begin by you telling us, giving us some idea how you have worked together and collaborated on this
I'd be
project.
happy to. Kathy has, over the years, been consistently enthusiastic and supportive of my bibliomania. And when this project started, I expected her help and support in in all aspects, but that's not how it turned out. I mean, she very, very, very quickly got absolutely absorbed in the organization, in the research, in the writing associated with this putting together this exhibition and its catalog. The best example I can give is I had written, maybe a third of the material, not even a third of the material. And Kathy, of course, took a look at it and turned my screeds into real prose. And after she'd done that, she said, look, I have a better idea. For the rest of the material, how about if I interview you? And I'll start with the interview material, and I'll write the stuff to begin with. So the bulk of what you see is the result of Kathy's research or Kathy interviewing me. And certainly the organization of the exhibit in detail reflects her judgment and some her help. So it's genuinely co-curatorship.
So every story has a beginning. The genesis of this collection, again, involves Kathy. You were a graduate student at MIT in the 1970s.
Yes.
Working on an MS or an MA and also a PhD. Busy with that, I can imagine. And one day, Kathy comes home a Saturday afternoon with a gift.
Yeah, it was a Saturday afternoon. I'm working away on who knows what, no doubt in a foul mood. I don't specifically remember, but it's a safe bet. And Kathy had gone out for a walk for some fresh air. And she returns and says, I brought you a present to cheer you up. She had, by chance, stumbled into a small antiquarian book fair in the basement of the Gutman Library, I think, at Harvard. And she hands me an American First edition of the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. And I open up the book, and a light bulb went off. I said, you don't have to be J.P. Morgan to collect books. It just hadn't occurred to me that regular folk could assemble a book collection. And I was transfixed, transformed, transported by this book. And I said, is the show open on Sunday? And she said yes, and we went. And as luck would have it, she takes me, more luck, she takes me up to the dealer that had, from whom she had purchased the book. And it was this fellow named Peter Stern, who I see lots of nods in the audience. And also at Peter's booth, at the moment we approached it, was a fellow collector who this was my meeting with a fellow named Dan Poznansky. So from moment one, I had a book fair, and two fantastic, they have, over the years, have become very close friends. Couldn't know two better people to get you in trouble.
Would you describe them as mentors for you?
Oh, absolutely. No, there's no question about it. Both of them,
Maybe just briefly tell us how you have a bookseller and a preeminent collector. We should point out that Dan Poznansky was a preeminent collector of Sherlock Holmes.
Absolutely one of the most talented, one of the most knowledgeable, and also incredibly generous man. Again, one of my favorite stories is they both shared with me the interesting places to explore in Boston, to find books in Boston. And I quickly built my own little orbit path and would, I don't say I made it every weekend, but many weekends I would go on my searches among the 6 or 8 interesting antiquarian bookstores. At any rate, after a month or two, I had assembled a collection. Prior to Kathy presenting me with a case book, I had I had the 2-volume Doubleday, the complete Sherlock Holmes stories, and not anything else. And an unhealthy affection for the character and the period and so forth, but in terms of collectibles, literally nothing. And so my collection had grown to maybe 2 shelves this long. And I happened to bump into Dan at Harvard Square. And I said, Dan, I'm really making progress. Why don't you come over and I'll show you my collection? And he said, great. He came over and he looked and nodded and very politely said, Glenn, I have another appointment I've got to run. But why don't we get together next weekend? And Dan came over the next weekend, and he brought with him 3 boxes of books. 3. And he says, Glenny, in his raspy Bronx voice, let me show you the basics that you need for a Sherlockian collection. And he gave me these 3 boxes of books, which became the heart and soul of my collection. So that's an example, my favorite example of a mentor.
Here's a question that you and I haven't discussed before, but I think it's relevant. What if Kathy had brought home Charles Dickens or John Steinbeck? Would you have developed the same passion that you did?
Certainly not at that moment. I certainly was fond of Dickens. But for reasons which would be difficult to explain, I had already developed and shown a great depth of affection for Holmes, Victorian London, detective stories as they were embodied in the Holmes writings, which I had rediscovered as an undergraduate. And again, sort of by chance, I discovered that there were like-minded people in the world, and they got together with some regularity, some frequency, and had these nice, very convivial get-togethers. They were very interesting folks in their own rights, and I fell in with a bad lot. So my interest in Holmes was substantial, and I can't imagine being motivated to collect anything else.
And you are a single author collector. We should
That's
be
it.
very clear about that. There is no room in your pantheon of
No. Well, it not only single author, but really single subject. I mean, Conan Doyle certainly had other writings. I mean, by number of words, most of his writings are on spiritualism, in which I have no interest. But writings which he was most proud of and are substantial are Gothic novels, stories of knights in daring do, and that sort of thing. And those he was very proud of, and is where he desired to be spending his time and effort. But I don't collect those.
So,
only Sherlock.
If you would, resolve an apparent paradox for me. On the one hand, you insist that you're not a completist. On the other hand, you have 7,000, and as I now understand, 8,000 items, not only about Conan Doyle, but specifically about Sherlock Holmes.
Yes.
Explain that for me, if you would.
Well, I certainly.
I'm sorry.
No. It's a reasonable question. I certainly don't have a checklist of everything there is to collect. My collecting first and foremost is driven when I see something if I really like it, and I will really like it if the object itself has an interesting story associated with it. It could be the peculiarities of a particular volume. For example, an inscribed volume would make it interesting enough for me. Or the book itself might have an interesting, a particular example of the book, but the edition itself might be particularly interesting because of its publication history, or the difficulties that Conan Doyle had getting it published, or the story was written to help out and submitted for publication to a friend of his who needed some smash hit in an early press he was doing, something like that. And so those are the things that make me interested enough in a book to acquire the book. And unfortunately for me, that has resulted in only, say, limit yourself, limit your scope if you want to have a good collection. And I had a limiting principle, but it hasn't resulted in a limited number.
So we talk about getting the book, and I really hope everyone who's watching has an opportunity to come and see this exceptional, extraordinary exhibition. And if you can't do that, check it out online, or better yet, get a copy of the marvelous catalog that Glen and Kathy have. Everything is in there, fully reproduced, fully discussed. But the point that you made about buying a book, and you loathe the word interdisciplinary.
I do.
As I do as well. But nevertheless, it's not just books.
No.
And if someone comes here and sees, we have posters, we have original art, we have manuscripts, we have notebooks, we have letters, we have all sorts of stuff, things. And I think when we talk about the modern collector has to kind of look outside the box and do some parallel thinking. And in keeping with that, we have 9 clusters here. You call them clumps.
Kathy has been after me for years to come up with a more dignified term, and I would welcome suggestions.
But comment, if you would, on this decision that you made to go beyond the book and to tell the deeper, richer, broader story of Sherlock Holmes.
I think, for me, what makes the story in the text block is not what drives me to collect a particular item. You can get, give or take, typographic or editorial changes, You can get now everything's in the public domain. You can download these words and get a PDF for nothing, for zero. The stories themselves is what generated my interest and my affection. But in the artifacts themselves, it's the stories other than the story in the text block that draws me in, that motivates me to have an item. So if you look at these things, I mean, how can you turn down, if you were fortunate enough to have the opportunity, a letter between Doyle and his literary agent A.P. Watts saying, "I'm okay with Noon's having a sixpenny series of adding The Hound of the Baskerville to their sixpenny series." Now it's a pretty dramatic book because of its illustration, but it's just The Hound of the Baskervilles, which you can get in 27 other editions. But this particular edition involved a commercial arrangement, which I was fortunate enough to be able to uncover through the discovery of this letter. And then subsequent to that, again, good fortune, I came across at an auction the original artwork that was used to illustrate the cover. Very, very lurid, very, very wonderful piece by H.M. Brock. And so, you folks all know this. You make your own luck. You make your own opportunities. It's not I'm wandering aimlessly in the street and this A.P. Watt letter fluttered down into my pocket. But nevertheless, it's only lucky that I happen to come across these particular objects. And together, they tell a very powerful story. And so I've acquired them, even though they're not books. The artwork, the letter, the book, of course, the book itself. And it also says something about Conan Doyle's commercial aspirations, selling a very, very inexpensive copy of The Hound. And the hardbound copy of The Hound was, £2 and change. And that's unreachable for even a middle-class professional, let alone a laborer. 6 pennies, just about anybody who had a decent job could afford such a book.
So you've used the word story a couple of times, telling the story. I've always maintained that every collector is a storyteller and every collection is a story. You have, it seems to me, 2 stories here that you and Kathy have put together, 9 constellations of things. Let's talk a little bit about developing the story, not only of the creation of the sacred canon, as you BSI people call it, and the development of your decision to make these 9 different constellations of materials, if you would.
Well, it is not. It's not as linear, as orderly as you describe. I have this general outlook and philosophy and enthusiasm, and these things just happen to come into being in my collection. For example, the very first story is a Sherlock Holmes story, Study in Scarlet, which was published in 1887. And I did not, at any point that I can recall, take it into my head, well, I have to build a constellation of objects around this. But as I cast my net, as I became more sophisticated and as a collector, started casting my net wider and wider, these other interesting materials came into my collection that were related to it. And a handful of them are here for that reason, because there is something to be said. So, as an example, one of the things is a copy of Mrs. Beeton's Christmas Annual, where Conan Doyle tried for well over a year and was turned down by 3 other publishing houses. Finally, Wardlock said, we will take it. It'll be a good piece for us to publish in the Christmas Annual associated with Mrs. Beeton's Cooking Magazine of Cookery. which had a Christmas issue which featured 2 original pieces of literature. And in 1887, one of those 2 pieces of literature was A Study in Scarlet. Conan Doyle had been compelled by the publisher Ward Locke to sell all rights to the story for £25. Over the course of his life, in letters, in his autobiography, he laments that he had let the book go so inexpensively, and laments about his efforts over the years to buy back the copyright for Ward Locke were rebuffed, and was never successful in that. But my particular copy of, and there are 3 dozen copies extant of A Study in Scarlet. Now, it was no doubt published in the hundreds of thousands in its time, but it's an ephemeral object. You know, it was Christmas annual paper, so that, relatively few have survived. This particular copy has this purple stamp on the title page, the Coburg Mechanics Institute and Lending Library. And I said, there has to be a story. Let me find out about this particular copy. The very short version of this is some sleuthing, and there are 2 places in the world, in the English-speaking world, that spell Coburg in the particular way it's spelled. It can be spelled with a U or without a U. And one of them didn't exist until well into the 19th, in Canada. But the other one in Australia has been around since the early 19th century. After any number of false leads, I get on the phone in the middle of the night, mid-morning in Australia, and speak to a Laurie Burchell, who was president of the Coburg Historical Society. We had a very interesting conversation. He did not sound like Crocodile Dundee. I knew he was speaking English, but I could barely understand him. And he probably had equal trouble understanding my English. But we managed to communicate, and he said, well, there's certainly a Mechanics Institute here. And they did take up a collection to establish a library, but no library was ever established. And I said, well, Mr. Burchell, I have this book with a stamp. And he said, well, send me a picture of the stamp. And so I did. And he said, this is fairly conclusive. Let me see what I can find out. And I got an email from him several months later. He was digging in the archive, and he said, I found in the annual business report from 1892 that the Mechanics Institute in Coburg was assembling books and had raised money to build a library. And one of the books in their assemblage was a Mrs. Beeton's Christmas Annual. And he said, this no doubt is your book. And he said, they never built a library because by the time they raised enough money, apparently the government of Australia had allocated enough money for there to be a continent-wide, a country-wide building of public libraries. And so they never built a public library. But they did establish a small number of books which they lent out. So that's that copy.
So we mentioned that the exhibition and the collection documents the creation of the oeuvre. Also, of equal importance is documenting the public reception. And I think this is where the artifacts come into play, become such an important component of what you've done. Well, the reception of how this character becomes a cultural icon and how he is perceived by people who read him. And you might talk a little bit about how the reception of Holmes is something that you've documented.
Well, probably an excellent example which is also, I think, shown in this exhibit is the book, the second Sherlock Holmes story, which was also a novel called The Sign of Four. And that also has a rather colorful beginning. Conan Doyle, it was written in 1890, and Conan Doyle was still at this point writing reasonably prolifically and having, to say the least, modest financial success there, his medical practice was going nowhere. He says, for example, he says in his autobiography around this time that he dutifully got up each morning, went out, polished his brass plaque, which announced his practice, swept the front porch himself, and then went back to the reception room to wait for patients that never showed up. But he made a transition about this time, saying, I am going to try and make a living as an author, not as a doctor. And roughly the same time, Lippincott decided that they were going to offer a magazine, the Lippincott's magazine, in the UK as well as in the United States. And towards this end, they had sent their editor-in-chief, a fellow named James Stoddart, to London to make whatever necessary business arrangements and to start cultivating some authors to produce material for Lippincotts magazine. And Stoddart arranged to have dinner at the Langham Hotel to these two young but reasonably well-received authors, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde. And the three of them had a dinner which Conan Doyle refers to as a golden evening. He and Wilde were quite close friends, substantial correspondence for a number of years, and then it ended. I think there are no dramatic stories. I think they just drifted apart. I suspect Wilde was a little too flamboyant for Dr. Conan Doyle, who was rather conventional, late Victorian. But what came out of that dinner was they both got a contract, both Oscar Wilde and Conan Doyle, to write a novel-length piece. And 3 or 4 months later, Conan Doyle submitted to Lippincotts the book, the story we now know as The Sign of Four. And Oscar Wilde wrote A Picture of Dorian Gray.
Talk about the trifecta for a publisher.
Right. And so what we have in the exhibit is both Lippincotts, the Lippincotts with Sign of Four, the Lippincotts with Dorian Gray. And at this point also, Conan Doyle was still acting as his own agent. You know, literary agency was, as a profession, was essentially unknown at the time. And after the sign, very shortly after the Sign of Four, Conan Doyle did connect with a fellow named A.P. Watt, who's credited in any number of places with being the first professional literary agent. But Conan Doyle is still acting on his own. Now, he smartened up with his experience with studying Scarlet, and the copyrights reverted to him in their entirety a few months after the appearance in Lippincotts. And he went on his own campaign to place it so he could make a little money. And in the exhibit are a letter and a postcard where he corresponds with a guy named James Hemingsley, who was a reasonably large publisher in the northern counties of England. You know, Birmingham, Hampshire Gazette was one of his publications. And the Doyle almost plaintively is asking him, is there room in one of your publications for this story? In his words, it's full of incident and would make a great serial. Do you think you could manage 10 guineas in order to publish this? And so those two letters are there. The story did not do very well. The hard copy volume sold about 1,000 copies in its first year. So the serialization was very important to Doyle in order to fill his pocketbook.
In 19th century fiction, particularly, the role of the illustrator is such an important aspect of publishing. And you think of John Tenniel and Lewis Carroll and Fizz and Dickens. We have a similar kind of a dynamic, a collaboration. And it leads me to the question here. The star of this show, clearly, top billing goes to Sherlock Holmes, but you have some supporting actors here. You have Sidney Paget,
Yes.
and William Gillette. Why don't we take them separately? Start with the illustrator.
Well, there are several art. Well, most notably, Sidney Paget did not illustrate the Study in Scarlet, but the subsequent short stories, all of them, until Paget's death in 1914. Until his death in 1914, were illustrated by Sidney Paget. And many of the pictures in our mind's in the public's mind's eye of what Sherlock Holmes looked like are due to Sidney Paget's illustrations. They're very evocative. The illustrations that we know don't reflect the artwork very well. They were inexpensively produced. I mean, the Strand magazines, one of its selling points, something that it advertised endlessly for the first year or two of its publication, was an illustration on every page. And this is a fairly substantial magazine, which sold for 10 pence. So you can imagine that the amount they spent on the actual production was not the highest technology available at the time. It was at least expensive. So in the magazines, they're very, very muddy. I have here, did I bring 8, Kathy, for the, or 7. I brought 7 Sidney Paget illustrations.
Original illustrations.
Original illustrations. Again, there's something magic about the number, 3 dozen. Of the roughly 150 illustrations that Paget did for the Sherlock Holmes story, there are about 3 dozen extant. And seven of them are here. And I would urge you to take a look. There, you can both see the Holmes you have in your mind's eye. I argue you will see the Holmes you have in your mind's eye. And they're nothing like the blotchy stuff you've seen in the magazines. The second fellow who did probably even more to establish the image of Holmes is a stage actor named William Gillette. In 1899, Conan Doyle wrote a play cleverly titled Sherlock Holmes. And he, at this point, was quite popular, quite successful. The first 26 short stories had appeared. They were massively well received by the public, and so he was a known commercial quantity. And he, among the impresarios, the producers he shopped this play to, was a fellow named Charles Frohman. In his day, Charles Frohman owned, in any real sense, the theater district in London, and was very influential in New York. In fact, those areas were referred to by his colleagues and some of the wags in the press as the Holy Frohman Empire. And Frohman, looked at it and said, "This is great, Conan Doyle, but it needs some work. And I know just the guy to do the script doctoring." I don't know what turn of phrase they used in Victorian times. But the fellow he had in mind was William Gillette, fabulously successful actor in late Victorian, early Edwardian times. Also, he had written William Gillette had written a handful of quite successful plays, both critically and commercially. At this time, he was also just acquiring ownership in a couple of theaters in the Northeast. So he was, to use an obnoxious phrase, he was a player in this world. And Gillette said, "Great, I'm happy to work on this project." Very, very cordial, and as we now know, very long-running friendship between Gillette and Doyle, and he started fairly extensive rewrites to Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Gillette was on the road with one of his own productions in San Francisco, staying in the Baldwin Hotel, and the hotel caught fire. And among the things that were lost in the fire were Gillette's notes and Conan Doyle's manuscript.
Wow.
Gillette wrote to Doyle describing the tragedy, and he said, "Not to worry, I've been at this for so long and so hard. I know the play virtually by heart. I can reconstruct it and finish the rewrite, and we can produce this play." And he did.
Is this a letter, by the way, in the collection?
This is not a letter I have, I'm afraid.
So how do we document?
Oh, that letter happens to be in the British Library.
Okay, but I mean, how do you document the relationship between Gillette and?
Well, besides letters which I do not have, but which I do have, among other things, after they completed the rewrite, the play was opened, was a great success. I do have a letter, two letters from Gillette to Conan Doyle, and the reply. One was, for example, over a Christmas, a few years after the show opened, Holmes inviting Gillette and the cast to, Conan Doyle inviting Gillette and the cast to his home for Christmas dinner. And Gillette writes back, "We're terribly busy. I'm sorry, my dear Doyle, cannot do this. We're just too busy in rehearsal. I hope we can take you up at a later date." However, when the show, another item which is here is the year of the opening of the show, which was in October or November. Gillette did a Christmas card. It's actually a little booklet of half a dozen pages of scenes from the play, and he sent a copy of this to Conan Doyle. And on the verso of this little booklet, Gillette writes, "Did you ever think that you would be receiving the greetings of the season from your creation?" William Gillette.
Let's go back briefly, if we may, to Paget a bit. I'd like to flesh that out a little bit, because so much of the way we visualize Holmes physically, the hat, the meerschaum pipe, is this due to the illustrator, or is this anywhere to be found in the
These are
writings?
absolutely due to the illustrator. There is no story in which Holmes smokes a meerschaum pipe. He smokes a briar, he smokes a clay, he smokes a cherry, but never a meerschaum. In fact, the meerschaum comes from William Gillette, as a matter of fact, not one of the illustrators. William Gillette writes to Doyle. He was very respectful of Doyle always. He says, "Would you have any objection if I used one of these pipes? They're much easier for me to handle while delivering lines than a briar or whatever." And Conan Doyle said, "Fine, whatever." Conan Doyle was done with Sherlock Holmes. He did not want to spend his energy, his literary creativity on Conan Doyle. So the meerschaum pipe is a good example. The deerstalker does not appear in any of the stories. Paget used it in one of his illustrations. Gillette used it in his depiction, but it is extra canonical.
But yet, it's the way
It's
so many of us-
indelible. It is indelible. I mean, people see that and they say it's a Sherlock Holmes hat. Nobody, very few people other than Sherlockians know it has a proper name, and it's called a deerstalker. Same thing with a meerschaum pipe. The gourd flavor, not the carved block of meerschaum, but the one where gourd with a meerschaum liner in it. It's a Sherlock Holmes pipe.
So-
and those are the results of.
So another apocryphal story, not apocryphal, but the expression "elementary dear Watson," that doesn't appear in any of.
There is no story in which Holmes says "elementary dear Watson." The closest he comes in the stories is actually shown in one of the Hound manuscript pages, where he says, "Interesting, though elementary." That's as close as Holmes ever gets to saying those words. And in fact, it's a popular game among Sherlockians to find the earliest source of the use of that phrase. For a long time, but given superseded some decades ago, it was thought that it was due to Basil Rathbone, who does say "elementary, my dear Watson." No argument about that. But it is by no stretch of the imagination the first occurrence of that phrase. For a short period of time, I held the world's record of the earliest occurrence. Around the centennial of World War I had occasion to look into this class of literature known as trench magazines. These were magazines that were produced by soldiers in the World War I trenches for their compatriots. So by soldiers, for soldiers. And I found a story which featured a character called Shell Shock Moans. And in the story, he does say "elementary, my dear Watson." So I had pushed it back to 1915. But fairly recently, a Sherlockian scholar, Ira Matetsky, it is Ira, isn't it, Kathy?
Peggy Purdue.
Sorry, Peggy Purdue.
Toronto
At Toronto Reference, my mistake. Peggy Purdue at Toronto Reference found an even earlier instance of "elementary, my dear Watson."
So I think something that all of us would agree today would be a cultural felony was something that McClure Phillips did to the manuscript of The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that, and then what we see in exhibition case over there, or the first case.
When the Hound of the Baskervilles first appeared serialized in the Strand magazine, and in those years, the Strand had an American issue as well as an English issue, so it appeared in both countries, and the Commonwealth and the U.S. in the Strand. And it was decided that this has been remarkably successful, and it came out as a book in the UK. And the manuscript was sent to S.S. McClure to make the U.S. book edition, to set the type for the U.S. book edition. And McClure, who was pretty good friends with Doyle through other paths, was very, very nervous about the commercial success of the book. And I did many things to promote things before it went out on the shelves. But one of the things he did is he writes to Conan Doyle, and he says, "I've got a great promotional idea. After we're done setting the type, let's take the manuscript, break it up into individual leaves, and we'll send it out to the bookstores to put in their store windows, and that will entice people to come in and buy the book." And so, indeed, the manuscript was broken into individual leaves and sent out to the bookstores, and be mere speculation how much it helped sales. Sales were spectacular. I mean, in the first 2 weeks, they sold 30,000 copies. In the first 4 months, I think 50,000 copies, and went through 3 or 4 or 5 printings.
This is after a 7-year hiatus.
This is a 7-year, by the way, yes, thank you. Sherlock had been out of sight. He had apparently gone to his death in Reichenbach Falls in the Final Problem in 1893, and The Hound of the Baskervilles was published in 1901, in the Strand magazine in 1901. Conan Doyle very cleverly put the story earlier than the Final Problem, so he didn't have to explain Sherlock Holmes coming back from the dead, or he didn't really die, he climbed his way out of those turbulent falls. He got rid of the problem that way. But it was phenomenally successful, but as a result of this rude treatment, there are, again, it's a magic number, 36 or 37 leaves left of what's estimated by word count. We don't have the rest of the manuscript. 190 or so pages must have been the original manuscript. And I have 3 of them here at the exhibit. 2 of them, when I'm asked, what's your favorite thing, I don't give the non-committal answer, well, it's like my children, I have no favorites. I mean, that's a non-answer, that's a cop-out. But if you press me hard enough, it's 2 of those 3 pages. They are pages 2 and 3 of the manuscript. It's not per se that it's, page 1 is not known to be extant. And it's not that it's, early pages, the first 2 or 3. The reason I'm so fond of them is you'll remember that the Hound of the Baskervilles starts in this absolute archetypical way for a Sherlock Holmes story. Holmes and Watson, at Watson's insistence, have gone out for a walk. They come back from the walk and they missed a client while they were out. Holmes berates Watson for having, lured them both out so they missed their client. But the client has left behind a walking stick. And so they both proceed, Watson completely unsuccessfully, Holmes, of course, with astounding success, to deduce a great deal about the case and about the client that they had missed on the basis of this walking stick. Well, that exchange, that dialogue is contained on those 2 pages. So it's just, for me, absolutely marvelous. I couldn't ask for
what
better
fantastic line appears? And
oh, right. That also the line, you know my methods. As a
apply them.
You know my methods, apply them. And it's also a edit. It's not in his first draft. Conan Doyle had a very specific, never varied over the course of his life, method of work. He worked longhand, always. In 1900 small, did modify that. He would send out his holograph manuscripts to a typing service, and what got submitted to the publisher was the typescript. But he himself, until his death in 1930, worked longhand. He always worked in pen. There is absolutely no evidence that he ever used an outline, that he ever wrote it out and then did a fair copy. There are letters where house guests remarked that he would retire to his office and in the middle of chaos, children running around and dog running around, simply write out his stories. So it genuinely appears his method of work was to write out the stories. Changes that occurred to him while he was writing the story out initially, he would sketch in pen. And then when he had finished writing out the story, he would edit in pencil. So most notably, his manuscripts have precious few emendations, period. Some you'll see in pen, and those were as he was writing, and some you will see in pencil, and those are after the fact. So the two notable phrases are, you know my methods, apply them, but also interesting, though elementary.
So I guess because we're speaking to a community of collectors and everyone gets satisfaction in different ways. So for so many, it's the hunt. For others, it's the acquisition. I think we all know, not to mention any names, know collectors who once an object is acquired, it goes on a shelf. We even know people who put things in vaults and never look at them again.
I don't understand. I understand.
So,
I understand the phenomenon, but I don't understand it.
So maybe discuss, what is the kick for you? What is the drive? What is the impulse?
Well, for me, the kick is kind of an arc. Certainly, the hunt is fabulous. I mean, besides all the people I get to interact with and meet and chat with and swap tall tales with, and road trips are endlessly rewarding. Then, of course, is the acquisition. But for me, not every single book, but most of the books also generate a project, a research project. Chasing down the purple stamp in the Study in Scarlet, chasing down the first first occurrence of Elementary, My Dear Watson. There's a book here, in the Sign of Four, which is a pirated edition, and it's inscribed by Conan Doyle.
That's amazing.
And as you folks know, the folks who were the victims of the pirateers, well, the authors were wildly antagonistic to the business, the fellows who promulgated this theft and so forth. So how on earth did this come to be? Well, that was a very, very satisfying, interesting project to figure that out. Do we have time for me to share that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So here I have this United States Book Company copy of The Sign of Four. The United States Book Company was a consortium which was assembled by a fellow named John Lovell, who was a notorious, one of the most prolific pirateers in the U.S. Principally in the 19th century. His nickname was Bookaday Lovell. And he got fed up with a very cutthroat business. I mean, getting your wares out to the widest audience as quickly as possible was mandatory to have any hope of making any money, and as inexpensively as possible. And he got tired of it, and in 1889 and 1890, he bought up a lot of his competitors. So a dozen or so of the in their day reasonably well-known pirateers were assembled under one umbrella called the United States Book Company. And one of their early publications under this imprimatur was Sign of Four. Besides this inscription, yours most cordially, ACD, on the paste down on the end paper is a ownership signature, Harlow N. Higginbotham. And I look up Harlow N. Higginbotham. Turns out he's a very notable fellow. He was one of the Chicago worthies. He was one of the original partners in the Marshall Field department store. He was helped established and was the president for the first number of years of the Field Museum in Chicago. He was whatever the highest ranking fellow, whether president, chairman, or whatever, of the 1893 Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, which was a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the discovery of America. A beloved philanthropist, gave all kinds of money to do all kinds of good deeds in Chicago, the end of the 2 centuries ago. At any rate, I did the profitable research that I did was I went to the newspaper morgue and found in several Chicago newspapers at the time. Oh, Conan Doyle did a lecture tour of America towards the end of 1894. And he spent a good deal of time in the Midwest, Chicago, Indianapolis, Cincinnati. He got as far as Wisconsin, Milwaukee. But he spent quite a bit of time in the Chicago area. And sure enough, one of the lectures he gave was in the Bijou Theater in the lovely Harlow N. Higginbotham mansion, at which dinner was given. And the date of, Harlow N. Higginbotham has his ownership signature and a date. And this dinner was the same date as he put on his ownership signature. So those are all the facts. And the story I weave is that Higginbotham had invited Doyle over, give the talk, have dinner. He ran out that morning, got himself a copy of the book, unaware that it was a pirated copy, signed it, dated it, shoved it under Conan Doyle's nose, who was too much of a gentleman to say, I don't think so, and signed the book for him.
We've talked about, have you mentioned his mother?
No, I don't think so.
And I think it's important, isn't it, how she influenced his writing?
I think probably a phrase which says it all. Every reference I have come across by Conan Doyle to his mother calls her the ma'am. The ma'am. All his letters, in his autobiography. It certainly seems to be cordial. It's not like she was a witch or something. But he wrote to her extensively. And his letters discuss finances a great deal, certainly discuss big family plans, like when he moved from one city to another, when he decided he was going to build his own home in Norwood or build his own home in Devon. These discussions are detailed and frequent. One of the big frustrations that I had because of the pandemic, and there were a number of them, with respect to this exhibit, were that the libraries, I don't have these letters, and they're all in the British Library, some of them in Portsmouth, but the libraries were closed. And so I had any number of very enthusiastic, very cordial responses to my requests for information or copies of this letter or copies of that letter from librarians like Catherine Cook, for example, just saying, we just don't have access to the material these days. So the letters I was able to consult mostly occur in a book by John Lellenberg, Dan Stashower, and I'm forgetting the third author. The third author is one of the living relatives, a little distant, of Conan Doyle's. Conan Doyle was his great uncle or something. Foley. Thank you, Charles Foley. Thank you, Kathy.
So tell us what happens.
I rest my case.
Tell us what happens when a book or an object enters your collection. What's the first thing you do?
Oh, well, the very first thing that happens is I try and make sure Kathy doesn't see it. I have to confess, there has been a change, maybe as long as 10 years ago, from unqualified wild support. In fact, more than once, when there was a pricey item on offer at auction, she encouraged me to spend more than I was thinking of spending. But about 10 years ago, she changed, and when no, it's still supportive. But now, when I think of getting a book or book comes, she says, "How does this improve your collection?" And I better have an answer. I think that's fair.
Okay, great. So we've mentioned piracies.
Yes.
A lot of collectors would say multiple copies of a single title are an indulgence. Not so in this collection. You have one book, you must have 50 copies of Hound alone. I mean.
The Hound was very rarely pirated. In fact, I have two.
That's the one.
Well, it was by McClure, the U.S. rights. He did the right thing, so to speak, with respect to copyright. So it would have been. Are there any attorneys here? Sometimes attorneys give me a hard time about pirates because the U.S. hadn't signed the initial copyright law, so there was no violation. Okay, fine. They had these quote publishers had nobody's permission and didn't pay the authors a nickel. So the Hound was protected, and so they're extremely scarce. There are only a couple that I know of. But there were other stories, such as Sign of Four, which were pirated mercilessly. And I'm sorry, what was the original?
It's a good word. Yeah.
And so what some people would regard as multiple copies. Well, certainly multiple titles, but the books that I have, for example, the Sign, I probably have several hundred Sign of Fours, but they're different publishers. Even a given publisher, I will have many copies, but there's something interesting to me that's different about the copies. They will have different advertisements in the back. They may have, on the publisher's stamp, they may have different addresses as these publishers were running away from their landlords, step away from the landlords, changing their addresses. So I may have a small number of oversights, but I genuinely, I go, because there's spaces at a premium, I do go through the books once in a while, and when I find true duplicates, I will deaccession one of them. But in ways that I find quite meaningful, they're all different. I love pirated editions. I have something like maybe 1,400 pirated books, and all different. One or two or three oversights, but all different.
And it's largely an unexplored area for scholars.
And it is largely unexplored period, and I'm resolved to make the time to explore them more thoroughly. There are many aspects, and I've tried to illustrate a number of them in the pirates I brought to the exhibit of publication that are demonstrated, exemplified by the pirated copies. So a couple of the most notorious, well, one of them is there are a handful of pirates which are bibliographically important. So for example, the first appearance of the Sign of Four as a book, that is separate, the only title in it is the Sign of Four, as opposed to Lippincotts, which is a magazine. It has 3 or 4 or 5 other literary offerings in the publication. But the first separate publication as a book is an American Pirate, Collier's Once a Week Library, which precedes by 3 years the first American official sanctioned, paid Conan Doyle some money, book edition of it. So there are a handful that are bibliographically significant. There are also any number of pirated editions where pirated books, which on the cover will say the Sherlock Holmes Detective Library, and may even have a picture of Sherlock on the cover. But the content, nothing to do with Sherlock, nothing to do with Conan Doyle.
And we have a couple of those over here, I think.
There are several of those here as well. That's about as shameless as it gets. But there are other peculiarities that I find absolutely fascinating. There are some books where the publisher's stamp is that of a store, of a department store. I haven't investigated deeply enough to know if this was something the store had done because they were handing out bonuses to their own salesmen, or it was the rule, not the exception, in these days of department stores to have book departments. And so maybe the copies of the books that they wanted, they preferred to have them printed with. So there are books there where the publisher on the title page is Strawbridge and Clothier, or Wanamaker's, or Sears. But my favorite is the Chicago Cloth Company, because their book on every page in the margins is an advertisement. Not only does it say Chicago Cloth Company on the cover, but in the margins, every page has the same ad. The one I like best is the one on the top of the page, which says, "We have shirts and jackets to burn, but we'd rather sell them to you." You can see that book over there. So there are fantastic stories to tell. For example, all of the, except one, all of the copies I have turned up of copies which have a have a department store as the publisher on the title page are all in the Philadelphia area. Well, that's an observation. That's a true observation now, and I presume it means something, and I will find out if it means something, but I haven't had time to figure out what it means yet. So there are bibliographic stories endless in these pirated books.
A lot of people might think that a book that has largely blank pages in it is a waste of time. But tell us about the salesman's dummy that you had?
Well, you've all heard of salesman's dummies, and they were, with some regularity, produced certainly mid to late 19th century. And McClure did indeed produce a salesman's dummy of the Hound of the Baskervilles. It was conjectured that such a book, because McClure did this with some frequency, produced a salesman's dummy. And these dummies are typically it's the book that it's a dummy of, same binding, often has a chapter or two, and the rest of the pages are blank. And that such a thing was produced for the Hound was conjectured, and indeed in 1960 small, this Sherlockian collector Nathan Bangus found one. And another turned up a little bit later. Both of those have since disappeared. At any rate, my friend Dan Poznansky, going through a catalog from a dealer in the Pacific Northwest, discovered another salesman's dummy. So you will see so it's in the display case, so you will see the only known two disappeared. They may be there somewhere, but the only known copy of the salesman's dummy. Now the salesman's dummy, this particular salesman's dummy, is distinguished by the bulk of the book is blank, but also the copyright page is different than every other printing, every other issue of the book. Very different. Every other issue of the book credits the copyright to being owned by George Nunes, the British publisher, and Arthur Conan Doyle. The salesman's dummy only lists Arthur Conan Doyle as the copyright owner. It was conjectured by Mr. Bangus that there had to have been some number of books, full American editions, that were published with this peculiar copyright. Well, one showed up in auction in Delaware, maybe a dozen years ago, and Dan and I both spotted it, and we decided not to bid each other to death. Suffice it to say that both of these, the dummy and the full copy of the book with this peculiar copyright notice, both believed to be unique, are over there for you to look at.
That's fantastic. So every collector I know of has at least one woulda, coulda, shoulda. Can you tell us anything you may have passed on that you now have deep regrets over?
Well, the woulda, coulda, shoulda, my woulda, coulda, shoulda, could've's a stretch. There's one story, the Valley of Fear, for which the complete manuscript is known. And it came up for sale maybe 20 years ago now. And a private sale, wasn't an auction. You know, this is the price. Maybe you can jawbone the seller down a few dollars, but this was not an issue of the price could be anything, could be crazy. But I couldn't afford it, and so I passed, and I regret it.
Do you maintain a want list?
Well, I have a want list in my head. I don't have it written down.
Well, but there must
Well,
be...
the two things I would most like, and I will not get either one of them, is page 1 of The Hound. You know, the very first few paragraphs are lovely in descriptiveness, but I'm missing like 3 sentences of that dialogue between Holmes and Watson. And if I had page 1, I'd have the whole thing. And then the second thing is the British Hound of the Baskervilles. There are 2 known copies in Dust Jacket. One's in the Bodleian, so it's not going anywhere. And the other is owned by a collector in the Midwest. And I think it's going to be another one of those things that's simply beyond my means. we've had a conversation, and there is a number at which he would part with it, but it's not a number that I'm capable of meeting.
You know, we've clarified that you're a one-author collector, but you are a collector in another area. And I wonder if we might just go off track just a bit and talk about cryptology, and not one, not two, not three, but 4 Enigma
No,
machines.
I'm happy. Sure, I'm happy to. I do have one other collection. It is not anywhere near the same depth, scale, not anywhere near that. But I do have an interest in cryptography, which was also sparked in grad school. And for me, the two most interesting times in the history of cryptography are World War II and now. And but I have a very substantial library. It's a reading library. There are a handful of things which I suppose could be considered collectible because they're hard to get. I wanted to read them, and that's why I acquired them. But I also, in grad school, promised myself that if the circumstances ever arose and I had enough money, I would get myself an Enigma machine.
Should we explain what it is for those who might not know?
The Enigma machine, the Germans, the Nazis, encrypted essentially all their critical radio traffic. You know, when you think of when you think of Blitzkrieg, when you think of Blitzkrieg, you say you go fast, you overwhelm, you annihilate that. Well, that has any number of, you don't just do it. That has any number of very practical challenges. One of them is communication. And when you get right down to it, the only practical way to communicate, if you're moving very, very quick, reliably communicate, is radio. Telephone lines will be torn down. You may not capture places that have phones and so on and so forth. And communication is absolutely critical. And so you're forced to use radio. Well, radio has a problem. Everybody can hear what you're saying. And so a fundamental part of the German strategy before the war was to develop a very elaborate radio crypto system. The workhorse machine to encrypt messages was called the Enigma machine. It's a machine roughly the size of a typewriter. It's about this wide, that deep, that tall. Has a cast iron frame. It weighs close to 50 pounds. So it's only in principle portable. And there were more sophisticated codes used at higher levels in the organization. But these were used by sort of at the company level. So there were a lot of them, and a lot of them were used to keep the communication secure. Not many of them survived the war. The best census I know of lists 300 large. There are there's a community of crazy people like me, and among the things is when we hear or smell or see an auction listing, we jot down the serial numbers and so on and so forth. So I think the census is pretty good. So they're relatively scarce. Anyway, I promised myself I could, and I did. 25 years ago, my first machine. It happened to be, the machines were slightly different. The Army's machine was different than the Air Force's machine, was different than the Navy's machine, was different than the Abwehr, the Nazis' equivalent to the CIA, external espionage, and so on and so forth. It was different than the machine that was used by the German railroads. But the one I wanted was the naval machine. It was the fanciest, the hardest to crack, all that kind of stuff, and I did. Suffice to say, at this point, I have 4 machines.
So people own Enigmas. I wonder how many of them, I know what the Enigma did, but you understand how it works. And I think that yours are all in operating.
They're all in working condition.
Functioning.
They're all functioning.
You know how to use them.
Yes.
Do you think your role at Apple, where you worked very extensively in hardware, had anything to do with your interest in?
No, my interest in this well preceded that. I joined Apple in '96. So in the grand scheme of things, well, it's not so recent anymore, but at any rate, it's certainly, I think I only had 2 Enigma machines when I joined Apple. The third machine I got, you see, you've gotten me started. The third machine I got showed up in a junk store in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. A junk store with a Yiddish name which translates as old clothes, alte Sachen. And I wish I could tell you that the guy didn't know what he had. It was a relative bargain, but it was not cheap. But here's this Air Force Enigma machine. The last machine I was able to get is in fact an Abwehr machine, and there are only 10 of those known. The Abwehr was a very small arm of the German military complex, so they didn't need very many machines. No, the records recovered are not very thorough for the Abwehr version. For the other Enigma machines, they're quite extensive. But for the Abwehr machine, not so much. So it's believed that there may have been as many as 300 of those made during the course of the war. There are 10 of those or so known. A friend gave me a tip 5 years ago, I guess, of a fellow who had one for sale in Buenos Aires. And we fairly quickly came to agreement, right. In the course of researching this machine, I learned any number of things, but one of the things that I learned is the biggest number I've come across in all my reading of the Nazi and Nazi sympathizers who fled to South America, the so-called rat line, the biggest number I've come across is 3,000. And in 1939, the outbreak of the war, the Germanophone, a community in Argentina alone, was 9% of the population. There was a substantial German community in South America before there was a Germany. The first very, very large establishment was 1870 or something, right? Germany's 73 or something. So that's why I say Germanophone. They came from all places. So there's another thing that I learned after the acquisition. You see, life gets very exciting after the acquisition.
That answers an earlier question.
So we quickly agreed on the terms, but he wanted me to come to Buenos Aires, pick the machine up in person, and pay cash. I wouldn't walk down my block with that much cash, let alone cross an international border and go to a city where George Bush's daughters had their pocketbooks picked. I mean, probably a few people watching them, you know. Anyway, we
to return briefly to, we have a few more questions. No, please. We haven't discussed the idea book. We've talked about, letters and all the other things, but and we also are interested in the creative process. And you have this idea book. And why don't you tell us a bit about that?
There's actually a whole case in this exhibit dedicated to holograph material. There are 4 short story manuscripts there, and again, each of the 4 in some physical or publication way is different and interesting. It's not, to have 4. It's not what motivated me. But the particular item that Nick refers to is, I guess like many Victorians, or certainly men of letters, Conan Doyle kept notebooks. And he kept a set of notebooks which he changed. He started a new set with each time he moved. So there's a set of notebooks known as the Portsmouth notebooks, there's a set of notebooks known as the Norwood notebooks, and there's a set of notebooks known as the Devon notebooks. And at least the Norwood notebooks are a set of 3. I think Portsmouth also a set of 3. I have the 3 Norwood notebooks in my collection. The notebooks, one is essentially an accounts book, which sounds pretty dry, but it's pretty interesting because you get to see where he went, when he was in which hotels, and so on and so forth. My notebooks don't cover the right period of time, but it's one of these account books that was able to trace the exact travel of Conan Doyle when he was dreaming up and started writing The Hound of the Baskervilles, for example. So there's a diary, and there's a book of thoughts, ideas for book, ideas for lectures, ideas for characters, and that's the book that I brought, the notebook that I brought.
Isn't the walking stick is in that one?
Well, yeah. The pages I opened it to, the place I opened it has two particular entries in it. That of particular of interest, and one has it's just a thought. He says, client missed by Holmes, left behind a walking stick that had been chewed by a bulldog. Well, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, admittedly, it's a Cocker Spaniel, but I think this is where that I say that's where this idea came from, even though it's a bulldog in his idea book. He also mentions travels of a woman that clearly presage the story that we now know as the cardboard box on the other page. So I picked that spot for the obvious reason, but it's full of his ideas.
I have a couple more things, and then we might open it up to some questions.
I'm game.
If you'd like. But Gretchen mentioned my book, Thank You, A Gentle Madness. The very first paragraph in chapter 1 begins with, in the life of every collector, the realization comes, what happens to the collection? And I wonder, since you established and built and shaped this magnificent collection of now close to 8,000 items of great scholarly value, have you given some thought to the disposition of the collection?
I absolutely have. Until, say, 10 years ago, my thought was sell it. Let other collectors, enjoy the excitement of assembling this with obviously other materials, different materials. And I changed my mind some years ago. Exactly what you said. I put a great deal of effort, all the joy. I need a better vocabulary, but I put a great deal of effort and time, and I think the collection has a coherence, has a style, has a flavor, and I would like to see that not lost. So I haven't put any significant time into it yet, but I'm going to try and place it in an institution someplace. I'm fully aware that there are large parts of it that would not be of interest. For example, something which wasn't even hinted at here, I have a great number of writings about the writings. The Sherlock Holmes has been the subject of scholarly debate and essays for 125 years. And some of it I find worthwhile, and I collect. If an institution doesn't want that, fine. Deaccession it. I have no, fine. I think you're making a mistake, but fine. So I'm not insisting that every single item be kept, but I would like the collection kept together.
So I think we should pay some tribute to the Baker Street Irregulars. The BSI, because among collectors, this group is unique. Sherlockians, as I've said, are a species unto themselves. And you were invested, I guess, in 1991, is it?
Yeah, 91.
Around there. But you were given a name. You're an investiture name.
When you're invited to become a member of the New York Sherlockian Society, the Baker Street Irregulars. Oh, by the way, it's the oldest one on the planet. 1934, established 1934. You are given a name, an investiture name, and the investiture name is picked by what in any other organization we would call the president of the organization. In our organization, he's called Wiggins, which was the name of the head street urchin that ran the band of the Baker Street Irregulars. So Wiggins picks your name. And my name, my investiture name is The Origin of Tree Worship.
Tree worship.
And the story behind that is in the short story, The Empty House, which is where Sherlock Holmes reappears after apparently having been killed in his fall over Reichenbach and having been missing even in the storyline for 6-8 years. And Holmes is in disguise. He is disguised as a old wizened, which I wasn't at the time I was invested, but old wizened bookseller. And the bookseller is on the street, and he's carrying this big stack of books with him. And Watson happens to bump into him. And he falls and drops all his books. And, of course, the disguise is so terrific, Watson doesn't recognize him, helps the old man up, helps him up with his books. And the old man says, well, you know, sir, here's a book, one of the most remarkable ever penned, The Origin of True Worship. Surely you have a blank spot on your bookshelf for this.
There's also a line in that segment, he says, these books, which I had so unfortunately maltreated, were very precious objects in the eyes of their owner, which I think applies really to all of us here.
So that must be what Wiggins had in mind when
I think so.
I picked my investigation.
Do we have any questions from the group assembled here today?
I was going to ask if, the story called The Dancing Men.
Yeah.
That combined both of your loves.
Exactly. The Dancing Men came up for auction 4 years ago. And I saw the manuscript and I said, and by the way, it's the only story with a, pardon my snootiness, a real code in it. There are other stories where it's, one flash for A, two flashes for B, that sort of thing. And I said, this has to be in my collection.
Glenn, do you, you had mentioned that you had the record for the elementary,
Yeah, for a very, very short time. And then Peggy showed me up.
but you didn't say where. Where's the new one? Where's
Kathy?
the earliest one?
I'm sorry, the earliest one is in 1902 or 3, and I believe it is a story by either G.K. Chesterton or P.G. Woodhouse.
Chesterton. It's in a story by G.K. Chesterton.
Plum. It's in the book Plum, Plum, by Chesterton, 1902 maybe. And that was it's a blog post on the blog run by the Toronto Reference Library.
See, this is what we do. This is what Sherlockians do. And these very important issues, like how many wives did Watson have? It's unlikely that it was only one. Actually, one of the best scholarly works I'm convinced, was in one. It's John Watson, M.D. In one of the stories, his wife refers to him as James. So there's this big conundrum among Sherlockians. What is the story here? Surely, don't call me sure. Surely his wife knew what his name was. And Dorothy Sayers wrote what I believe is the definitive essay on this problem. And she observed, a very scholarly essay, but she observed that we all know that John was Scottish extraction, well known. And his middle name, H, must have been Hamish, which is Gaelic for James. So it was a pet name. End of conundrum.
I have one question. It was a terrific presentation, by the way. So we know that Sherlock obviously had his assistant Watson there always. Was there an equivalent assistant for Arthur Conan Doyle? I mean, was it?
It's interesting.
That is great. The straight answer is no. But he certainly had a number of secretaries, which, among other things, if you look at his letters, and there's some examples here, they're in a secretarial hand, and you don't need to be a heliographer? What's a handwriting expert? Paleographer, whatever the fancy Greek word is for. You don't need to be one of those, because they all signed besides Arthur Conan Doyle, they all signed it with a glyph. Like on modern correspondence, you'll see the letter CC and then the slash and then the typist letter. So they sign them with a glyph, and it's reasonably easy to chase down if the British Library is open. which glyph goes with which of the secretaries. But in terms of somebody that substantially helped with his work, so to speak, he did not have a Watson. Now, there are any number of stories where he clearly, the story emerged, like The Hound of the Baskervilles. The story emerged when he took a golfing holiday with a club buddy of his named Robinson, and they were trading this is written about in his autobiography and letters in Robinson and writings about Robinson. They were trading stories about, there were lots and lots and lots of myths in Devon where they happened to be playing golf about these hellhounds, these demon hellhounds would magically appear and so on and so forth. So where the idea came from is absolutely clear, and it was a result of these conversations. And actually, this is a particularly good example. If you look at the book at Doyle's insistence, the book comes with a little acknowledgement, at least in the British and the American, to Robinson on the end paper, not in an acknowledgement section, but there's a little letter, 4-sentence letter saying, this story came about because of doesn't say his golfing holiday, but it's the conversations with Robinson.
Anyone else?
No, I don't have a question. You have a question. Please.
Just keying up the mentioned disguises, dressing up, obviously, famously dressed himself as Professor Challenger for the dust jacket of Lost World. I don't know, is there any evidence of him either dressing as Sherlock or whether formally for publication purposes in some ancillary way, or just
not that I know, but your point is well taken. I don't have these objects, but there are photos of him, dressed as a Viking and as a knight in armor. So and Professor Challenger. So Conan Doyle certainly more than once, dressed up.
Glenn, do you collect any of the, if you will, showbiz, playbills, movies, lobby cards, any of that sort of thing, and or foreign translations?
Foreign translations is easy. I do not collect those at all. I have a handful of Japanese that have been given to me as gifts by Japanese Sherlockians, so of course I hold on to those. And I have 2 books which are so bizarre that I couldn't resist. I'm not remembering off the top of my head where I found it, but I have a copy of The Sign of 4, published in Brooklyn in Yiddish. I mean,
Yeah. So I have a question.
And I was at a book.
No, go ahead. Finish.
I was at a book fair in Tampa, St. Pete. Very modest fair, and I spot this. I knew it was a hound because it had a very lurid cover, and I look at it and it goes Der Hund von Baskerville, German edition. But I pick it up and open it up. Published in Milwaukee. How can you resist? So, and on the theater and movies, I do have a small number of representative movie things. Again, because they really resonate. So, for example, I have lobby cards and slides for Barrymore's silent Sherlock Holmes. William Gillette, one of their tours ended in 1916, ended in Chicago. And in those days, there was a movie studio in Chicago called the S&A Studio. And somebody had the idea, gee, we got the sets, we got the actors, we got a movie studio, let's put the play on film. And so in 1916, the William Gillette play of Sherlock Holmes was filmed. It was moderately successful. We have turned up reviews in various cities and had reasonable success, reasonable circulation, and it was promptly lost. A print was found in 2015 in Poland, and I helped with the restoration of the film. So there is now you can get it on I won't say any, but certainly two of the better silent film purveyors. Lobster Studios, for example, has it, and so on and so forth. So you can see William Gillette in Sherlock Holmes, 1916.
Do you know how many languages he was translated into?
Well, when I did look into this in detail for a talk maybe 10 years ago, and the only thing that I don't know the number, but the only thing that exceeded it was the Bible. There was no other book in his. I could not find. Looked very carefully, and the only thing I can find in more languages was the Bible.
Wow.
It's mind-numbing.
Glenn, two things. On the Lippincotts, you didn't mention, but most people may not know, that in effect those Lippincotts run, and the third one was Kipling's Light That Failed. It really was a trifecta, to use Nick's word.
No.
And those stories were basically the entire magazine.
Yes.
In each one. And I was curious first, I've got the three versions of The Light That Failed, one of which was in Melbourne, and because of the time zone, that makes it the first edition of editions.
Congratulations.
That's great.
I'm waiting for it to be knocked down, and I don't know of any other
Yeah,
copy.
but enjoy it while it lasts.
Yeah, right. It'll be about as long as your elementary. And then Lovell, who put together the conglomeration of the United States Book Company, was actually a Canadian.
Yes.
And shipping into Buffalo. And he got this idea, as you noted, of in order to beat the pirates, and he did it with Kipling. I hadn't heard he'd done it with Doyle, but he sent over a young man named Walcott Balestier, who's of the Connecticut Balestier family where there were governors back in the colonial period. And Walcott, who died suddenly, and Kipling married his sister on the rebound the weekend of his funeral, proposed on the weekend of the funeral, was also the agent who went to Kipling and put Lovell's deal forward, which was, I'll give you 10 pounds for X, Soldiers 3, and you'll get some money, and everybody will then pirate what I paid for, but at least you'll cream it off at the beginning. Balestier also represented McClure, and I wondered how Conan Doyle got connected with McClure.
Oh, I don't know the actual first connection, but a profound connection was during Conan Doyle's first trip to America.
The 1894 one.
The 1894 one.
Where he had Thanksgiving with the Kiplings in Brattleboro.
Yeah. And played golf. Much to the surprise of the natives who'd never seen golf, and here these two adult men with a stick chasing red balls around in the snow.
And then Doyle sent him the first skis set in New England.
I knew he was credited in the UK with bringing ski. I didn't know he was credited in New England with skiing.
He sent them to Kipling, and Kipling skied on them, and they were the first Scandinavian skis.
You and I are having a good time, but this is not polite to the rest of the audience. But what I was going to say with respect to McClure is I don't know when they first met, but that interval of time, their last meeting, was the last dinner that Conan Doyle had in the United States before he headed back to London was at the Aldine Club. And during the course of that dinner, McClure was in really, really, really bad financial straits. I mean, he was about to go under. And he had a conversation with Conan Doyle, and Conan Doyle wrote him a check. So, again, I'm not remembering when they first met, but that was And by the way, it's one of the few investments, maybe the only investment that Conan Doyle made where he made money. That was one of the reasons he needed to write, because his investments were disaster.
Well, I think this has been a stimulating afternoon. I want to thank you all. Thank you, Glenn.
And
Thank you,
certainly,
Nick. Thank you very much.
Grolier wants to thank both of you for a wonderful exchange. First of all, and we also want to thank all of those viewers that have tuned in to be part of this conversation and with us today. Goodbye, good night.
Nick, that was great.
Was it okay?
Thank you. Oh, no,
Did I
it
miss
wasn't
anything?
okay. It was great.
Did I miss anything?
It was chock-a-block full of interesting things,
Yeah.
relevant things.
And
so-
nobody left.
And nobody left.